Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching TopTenz, and in the video today, the top 10 old school celebrity scandals that would totally have broken the internet. And just before we get started, I would like to say that I've recently started a new channel. It's called Biographics, and we look at, from the name you can probably guess it, biographies of famous people from history as well as the present day. We've got loads of different people that we're running kind of longer format videos on. They're about 20 minutes long, taking a real deep dive in this similar kind of format into these people's lives. So please go check out Biographics. There is a link in the description below, and if you like what you see, do subscribe. Alright, let's get into it. Nowadays, celebrity scandals are fairly common, and any time a celebrity sneezes wrong, you hear about it all over the news. Whether it's an affair, someone yelling at an employee at a coffee shop, or whatever other fairly basic scandal, the media will report it as the most amazing breaking news that has ever happened in, well, the history of mankind. The internet will obsess over all involved and personally harass them on Twitter for their own amusement. However, back in the day, there were many scandals that would make today's look pretty tame, and we can only imagine how insane the internet would have gone if these things had happened. Number 10. Jimmy Page dated a 14-year-old who lost her virginity to David Bowie even earlier. Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin fame is an easily recognizable name and one most people don't associate with any kind of scandal. However, Page actually had a bit of a problem when it came to statutory rape. Back in the 1970s, despite laws designed to prevent this sort of thing, baby groupies, underage girls who followed around rock stars, were a common sight, and abuse was fairly rampant. Page, during the height of his fame, struck up a relationship with a 14-year-old groupie named Lori Maddox. To make matters worse, the relationship, it wasn't just sexual, but very, very creepy. In order to avoid worries about the law, he made a deal with her mother so she wouldn't call anyone about what was going on and kept her hidden in hotel rooms most of the time, well out of the way of others. However, this may not have been the first time that young Lori had her innocence taken advantage of by older men. According to an interview she gave decades later, before she even met Page, she and another underage friend had sex with David Bowie, who went to lengths to proposition them. She claims that Bowie was very gentle because he knew it was her first time, but that really does not make it okay. Number 9. Judy Garland was horrifically abused during the filming of The Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz is a family film that's also known for having some legitimately creepy elements. We're looking at you, flying monkeys. But for Judy Garland, who played Dorothy, it was a nightmare in real life. She was only 16 at the time of filming, but the studio was giving her drugs in order to get the performance that they wanted, and some believe she was already addicted to drugs like amphetamines and barbiturates before filming had ended. She was also forced to wear very tight corsets, and the studio bosses even sent spies to make sure that Garland didn't eat anything besides chicken soup and black coffee, and also they made sure that she smoked 80 cigarettes a day in order to stay thin. However, this was just the beginning. To make matters worse, she also found herself a target of harassment by the Munchkins. According to the memoirs of Garland's late husband, the little people would reach under her dress and sexually harass her, thinking they could get away with it because they were so small. And while the rumor that one of them hung themselves on set is not true, they were indeed known for having orgies in their hotel rooms and causing such a ruckus that the police were called on a regular basis to deal with them. Sadly, much of this was the fault of the studio itself, which had pulled a bunch of little people from all over the world into one place who had never seen so many like themselves at once before, and they proceeded to underpay them so much that many resorted to panhandling and prostitution in order to survive during filming. Number 8. The Kent State shootings would be the subject of endless analysis today. The Kent State shootings, for those who aren't aware of the event, happened on May 4th, 1970, during the height of the Vietnam War protests. In recent months, people had been both burning down and trying to burn down ROTC buildings on campuses, and the police and the military, they were on edge. The ROTC building at Kent State had been burned down recently, and no one had been caught. More protests were set for days later, with National Guard swarming all over the place. This set the stage for an event that has left many people scarred to this day. During the protests, the National Guard started trying to corral the protesters and push them back in another direction. For some reason, which is still hard to piece together, some of the guardsmen decided that they should fire their weapons. In all, 67 shots were fired in a very short amount of time, and when the students had finished dispersing and the smoke had cleared, 4 people were dead and another 9 were wounded. Even without the internet, analysis of the event was heated, with many students taking photographs, comparing angles, and trying to make sense of the entire situation. In the age of the internet and full video recording, it's likely the analysis and debate would have basically never ended. Number 7. JFK's affair with Marilyn Monroe, as well as his general unfaithfulness to his wife. John F. Kennedy is one of the most beloved presidents of all time, partly because he was able to do such a good job during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but also partly because he was killed before his time. In a way, the assassination of JFK allowed for a rather inaccurate picture to be drawn up about his life and his existence over the years, which doesn't really show the kind of man he truly was. Most people think of Kennedy as a man who talked about giving service to your country, being politically courageous, and doing what is right and moral. However, in his personal life, Kennedy had pretty much zero respect for the sanctity of his and his wife's marriage. He constantly cheated on his wife, and when she would confront him about it, understandably very hurt, he would simply claim that his health problems required him to regularly sleep with a lot of women. He just couldn't help it. The fact that he tried to throw off personal responsibility for his dalliances by blaming a disease shows just what kind of person JFK really was. He was also known to have had an affair with Marilyn Monroe and then tried really hard to cover it up later. After she died, he tried so hard to cover up his involvement with her that many believe to this day that he was somehow responsible for her death. If it had happened today, people would never stop speculating about whether or not JFK was not just a serial cheater, but also a murderer. Number 6. Jerry Lee Lewis, a famous rock and roll star, married his 13-year-old cousin. Jerry Lee Lewis was a famous rock and roll star in the 1950s. For those who aren't familiar with him, Great Balls of Fire was one of his first hit songs. He was doing really well and had a promising career ahead of himself. In fact, he could have probably been absolutely huge. However, he went and made a decision that was really bad in pretty much every way you can imagine. While he was still married to another woman, he made a triumphant announcement during a concert tour of England that he was going to marry his 13-year-old cousin, Myra Gale Brown. And the newspapers, well, they went absolutely nuts. His concert tour in England fell apart as his popularity quickly and sharply dropped. No one wanted to be associated with a man who marries a 13-year-old relative, and, well, his career, it never really recovered to what it could have been. This is likely because he showed no remorse at all and instead went full on ahead with his plan and showed absolutely no regrets, at least until 10 years later, when she was no longer the prettiest young thing in the world to him, and he decided to divorce her as well. In today's age, he'd likely would have been arrested based on statutory laws for his crimes, and the internet would have had a field day mocking him for marrying his underage cousin. Number 5. Charlie Chaplin stole J.D. Salinger's underage girlfriend. Charlie Chaplin is the silent film star best known for using the Hitler moustache long before Hitler went and ruined it. Most people simply know him as an important comedian and influencer in the early days of Hollywood and silent film. But while he enjoys a fairly decent reputation today, he wasn't a particularly nice guy. Chaplin was a nasty tyrant to his wife and children, and he had a reputation of being extremely difficult, and then when he was 54 years old, he was courting an underage girl. The girl was named Una O'Neill, daughter of then-famous playwright Eugene O'Neill, and she was also being courted, by the way, by J.D. Salinger of The Catcher in the Rye fame. When she turned 18, she made her decision and decided to go with Chaplin instead of Salinger. Her father was incensed because Chaplin was 54 at the time, and he cut her out of his life entirely. This is something she never actually forgave him for. Considering how the internet reacted when Woody Allen married his adopted, barely legal daughter, we probably have a good idea of how people would feel about this particular scandal. Number 4. John Lennon beat both of his wives while pretending to be a messianic figure of world peace. John Lennon is one of the most beloved and famous members of the Beatles, but the truth is that in life he was an incredibly mentally troubled person who was horrible to all of the most vulnerable people around him. In his first marriage to Cynthia Powell, he was physically and emotionally abusive, both to her and their son Julian, who he would smack for all kinds of things. According to their housekeeper, he would smack the kid for bad table manners, even though the child's manners were better than most. The housekeeper said that she felt John Lennon had a problem with violence in general. He is also believed to have been physically abusive with Yoko Ono and admitted at one point in his life that he hit pretty much any woman and that it was always the most violent people who went for the peace and love stuff, ostensibly because of guilt. He also cheated on both his first wife, having an affair with Yoko, and then had an 18-month affair during his relationship with her as well. No matter how beloved an entertainer he may have been, it's hard to imagine him getting through that kind of scandal in the days of the internet. Number 3. Steve Jobs cheated Steve Wozniak out of money in the early days for reasons of sheer petty greed. Steve Jobs was not known for being the nicest guy in the world. He had a reputation of being incredibly demanding and hard to work with, and taking all the credit for anything good for himself. He was also very arrogant, believing that his mostly fruit diet could save him from cancer instead of, medical treatments. However, most people still don't think of him as an evil or a particularly mean person. Geniuses tend to be quirky, and Steve Jobs basically was Apple. The company simply hasn't been the same without him at the helm. Unfortunately, if people had known early on who the man was, he may never have enjoyed the beloved reputation that he had with so many for so long. Now, most people know of Steve Wozniak, the tech genius who is known for being better at inventing, but not nearly as good at business as Jobs. Now, in the early days, the two worked together for some time before parting ways due to their own differences. While they parted amicably at the time, Wozniak had no idea how badly he had been cheated. Very early on, Jobs set up a deal with Atari to make a game for them, with a bonus for using the smallest number of chips possible. Jobs approached Wozniak about splitting the fee, and Wozniak, being an incredibly nice guy, jumped at the opportunity, despite the fact that he would be doing the majority of the work. Even though he did most of the work, and the project exceeded expectations, Jobs secretly kept the majority of the money and the bonus that Wozniak worked so hard for, all for himself. Wozniak only knew that he had received much less than half of the payment years later, and cried when he learned of his former friend's dishonesty over what was a relatively small amount of money. Steve Jobs may have managed to build up a reputation as a beloved tech icon, but if he had done that to Wozniak in the age of memes, he would have been an instant pariah all over the internet. Number 2. Fatty Arbuckle was tried for raping and murdering a woman at his own celebration party. Fatty Arbuckle, for those who aren't aware of him, was absolutely huge in the early days of the silent film era. He was the man responsible for discovering Charlie Chaplin and mentoring him to the greatness that he achieved as a comic. Arbuckle was on top of the world, and it was when he was at the top that he took his longest fall. He was having a party in a local hotel with actors, actresses, and others in the industry, and spent a few minutes in a bedroom with a young actress named Virginia Rapp. After a short while, she was heard to be screaming. When everyone rushed in, the woman claimed that Arbuckle had done this to her. She was very drunk, so people assumed she was having a drunken fit, as her clothes were still on. A few days later, she was taken to the hospital for her pain and died of a ruptured bladder. The media went absolutely nuts, accusing him of raping and accidentally killing the woman. Hollywood was encouraged to disown him, and he was blacklisted despite no charges yet being proven. He could not find work and had mounting legal bills and debts. People would spit on him outside court and heckle him in the streets. However, he always maintained his innocence, stating that her clothes had been on, he had carried her to the bed, went to the bathroom, and came back to find her in pain. He was tried 3 times with 2 hung juries and eventually found innocent of all charges, except for the charge of drinking bootleg alcohol. Still, some wonder how she died. Many believe Arbuckle was responsible, but the case itself was very spotty. Rapp's friend, who had been the one to accuse him, refused to take the stand and had a history of extorting money. Rapp also had a pre-existing condition involving inflammation with her bladder, so it is possible the entire thing was a huge misunderstanding or an accident and no rape or murder had occurred. And, well, we can only imagine what would have happened if Twitter had been around back then. Arbuckle would have probably had to burn all his social media accounts and go live in the mountains for a while, at least until things blew over. Number 1. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, known for logic and reason, was ridiculed for believing in the paranormal. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Harry Houdini are actually 2 people who seem like fairly unlikely friends. Both were extremely passionate about extremely logical but also very clever and intricate practices that require deep thought, analysis and planning. Houdini would even put his life on the line for such tricks, and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle would spend an incredible amount of time working on a single Sherlock Holmes story in order to set up the clues and put it all together. What is surprising, though, is that their friendship started based on something extremely illogical, and that would be spiritualism. Houdini and Doyle were both interested in seances. Doyle's wife was a medium, and Houdini was trying to contact his dead mother, so, well, they set up a seance. The entire thing, it didn't go well. Doyle's wife, Jean, claimed to have contacted Houdini's mother and said that she wished him a Merry Christmas. But Houdini's mother, well, she was Jewish and did not speak English, so he soon denounced all mediums as frauds. This is something that greatly angered Doyle and went a long way towards ruining their friendship. One of the other major triggers was the ability abilities of Houdini himself. The man who created Sherlock Holmes was so astounded by Houdini's tricks that he insisted that his friend had the power of dematerialism, and when his friend insisted that he was not doing anything supernatural, it made Doyle increasingly angry and frustrated. In the end, the two parted ways because a man who was famous for writing about the most logical man in the world could not reconcile a friend who did not believe in fairies. It is almost unimaginable how Sir Arthur Conan Doyle would have ruined his own reputation if this had occurred in the days of viral memes. No one would have taken the Sherlock Holmes series seriously ever again, and his reputation would have been entirely ruined. So I really hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, hit that thumbs up button and do not forget to subscribe. Also, if you're looking for something else to watch, do check out my other new channel. It's called Biographics. We do longer form biographies of notable people from history. There's a link in the description below. Please do go check it out, and if you like it, please do subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.